be here. And I'm starting with a story for you. And the story really goes like this. When I grew up outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, my dad was an Air Force guy, and I always thought I would grow up and be like an archaeologist or an anthropologist or a paleontologist. And I did go to school to become a marine biologist, so I was still in that science field. And when I got out of school for marine biology, I did exactly what you would imagine I would do afterwards. I went right into banking. Not really my jam, but I did it for a while. And at this point, I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, brand new up there, and the Loma Prieta earthquake hit. And when the earthquake hit, there was an area called the Cypress structure that was a freeway section that collapsed on top of itself, that was and trapped the cars that were in it and the people within those cars. And after a disaster, if you've not ever been in one, what happens is everybody goes home to their people and scatter. And I didn't have any people because I was brand new to this area. And so just to calm my nerves and to have some sense of belonging, I started volunteering for the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. And they actually sent me out to the Cypress structure, that freeway that had collapsed, to provide support staff, support for the emergency workers. So I got to watch this most amazing rescue effort. And it really inspired me so much so that I went back to school, got a degree in fire science, and became one of the first female firefighters in the San Francisco Bay Area. I worked in Redwood City, if any of you know the Bay Area. From there, I made another obvious transition and started a manufacturing company. And from there, I moved to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and started maybe a more common transition. I opened a lifestyle store that was on the square, the main square in Jackson Hole. It was branded to go between Dean and DeLuca's and Williams Sonoma and Crate and Barrel and Pottery Barn. So it was going up the center and selling essentials of living well, which meant furniture, art, but maybe the best salami or best pasta sauce. And we had a wine bistro attached to it. So at the same time as I did this, I went back to the school. This time I got my sommelier training through the Court of Master Sommeliers. And then I was in the process of franchising this whole thing. And so my uncle Bill founded Dunkin' Donuts. He was also the creator of the whole process of franchising. And I was bound and determined to follow in his footsteps. And everything was going great. I had maybe about 6 months of benchmark numbers to get done so that we could figure out how to best duplicate when my marriage really wasn't going so well, and I decided it was time to file for a divorce. In response to that, my husband decided it was time to take a lot of money, six plus figures, out of our business bank account, which then made my $36,000 a month rent check bounce. And a lot of other things happened that chapter of being in this wine world closed. I did a lot of consulting after that, and then also felt like, wow, I better start recreating what will I do. And I went back to school, got a degree in global leadership and influence because I was doing this consulting and really worried about what would happen when people who knew me ran out of the need for me. And people like you might go, well, gosh, why would we hire you to help consult our business? And I thought, what would I say? Because I'm this badass firefighter marine biologist and I can help you with your business development. And so I thought I better do more. So, a degree in global leadership and influence, followed by a master's in conflict resolution and negotiation, followed with a deep dive into the world of neuroscience. And that was all really just about how do I survive the demise of my life at that point in time. All of that led me to a really fun opportunity to become the mediation services coordinator for Idaho's largest district court. And over that time, it's grown to where I'm an advisor to the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA. And the United Nations has brought me in to teach conflict resolution to their teams all over the world. And I've since negotiated or facilitated more than 14,000 conflicts. So it's something that I live and do every day. And I do it in a way where I've been able to put the lens of neuroscience over how we manage conflict and communication. And the results of that have been that I'm able to raise resolution rates and satisfaction around difficult conversations and negotiations in a way that is fantastically an improvement over what industry norms were before we started doing this. And so, with that in mind, over the next bit of time that we have together, I'm going to share with you some of the things about your brain and the brains of others that you might want to learn about. I also have a slide deck that I'll be sharing and not sharing all the time, only because I find that you don't learn as much if I just have a slide deck playing and then you have kind of my disembodied voice talking on the side. So I'll share it and unshare it. But right now I'm just going to chat with you for just a minute. And so when we're talking about neuroscience, the really great thing about it is it really helps you understand why we do what we do and why we think the way that we think and why we react the way that we react. And what that ultimately means is it gives us a little bit of grace and a little bit of empathy. So sometimes I might be really keyed up, and instead of thinking I'm just a hot mess in this kind of thing, I can slow down and say, ooh, my brain's a little activated, so I can cut myself some slack. Likewise, when people are coming in hot, and I think normally would have thought, man, quite frankly, what an ass, what a jerk, like, what are they thinking? I can now think their brain is in a fight or flight mode and they're coming at me because their brain is not open for business and they're just reacting. So it helps me be much more patient with others as well as myself. And when you can do that and step back from the reactions that you'd normally have, then all of a sudden you have control over your brain and you have much more control over the decisions that you're making for any of these high stakes conversations. And that is fantastic. And just one quick thing I would tell you about that is when I started at the courthouse program, my team's resolution rate was 58.3%. So if you came to mediation, that was the odds of whether or not you'd get an agreement or not. My own were 62.2, which is better. But if you were taking a college class, both of those statistics would mean we were doing a really bad job, right? Like those are not good winning odds. And so, with that in mind, once we started putting the neuroscience into this and why our brains do what we do, when I left the program to build my private practice and consulting firm, my team's resolution rates increased to 85.5%, and mine are typically north of 95%. So if you think of, am I going to enter into a hard conversation or a high stakes negotiation? Would you rather have a 62% success rate of getting this done in a good way or 95? I think you probably know the answer for that one. So let's lean into the brain for a minute first, and then we can actually pull out some reasons and some techniques I want you to utilize. So we'll talk about the brain. We'll talk about how the brain deals with things that it doesn't quite have all the answers for. We'll talk a little bit about how stressed brains work or don't work very well. We'll talk a little bit about how our brains and emotions factor into this and a couple other things. So, when it comes to our brains weigh 3 pounds. So if you think of all your body weight, your brains don't take up a lot of that weight, but they're very hungry. So they use 25% of all the energy that we have available for us on any given day. And our brains still deal with things in very much of an ancestral way of when our brains developed hundreds and thousands of years ago. And so, with that in mind, our brains don't want to use up a lot of energy because it might need it for something that is critical for us that keeps us alive later. So they're very lazy, they're very hungry, and they're really about pattern recognition and looking at what you're dealing with now versus what it's experienced in the past. And oftentimes it's overlaying that information onto the current circumstances. Unfortunately, the current circumstance might not, it may look the same, but it might have different parameters as well. So we have to really fact check our brain and really make sure if the thing that I'm fired up about and fighting about are really this current situation or just because it feels like the past. So the name of the game in any of this new skill development is slowing down and becoming observing of how your brain is. And so our brains are also really interested in survival. So when we look at the big things our brains want, one is the ability to procreate, because that was what helped us move our genes on to the next generation. So that's significant to our brain. Equally significant is how do we get food? How do we get shelter? How do we get away from threats really fast? And how do we maximize the rewards that we're after? And how do we do all of this with the least amount of effort? And so those are always the overarching theme of our brain. And when it comes to that, I want to pose a question out to you all. And my question is, there's a lot that happens under the hood of our brain where we don't really have any knowledge of what our brain's working on. And then we have a conscious part of our brain that we have control of on, the part of you that decided what you were going to wear today, or the part of you who makes an immediate decision about what you want for lunch. I can tell you that what's happening under the hood is far greater than what's happening consciously. So I'm wondering if any of you could give me a shout out as to how much percentage wise on a scale of 1 to 100, 100%, what percentage do you think are the thoughts that are happening under the hood? And if any of you can, I think you might have access to chat boxes, or even if my conference team has a guess, I would love to hear one or two of those. Somebody says 45%. Okay. Any other guesses?
Again, a lot, but Carol, I've been wondering, like, is there a difference between men and women? Because I feel like I have a lot more thoughts in my head than my husband.
You have a lot more data points for how you factor information. But as far as what's happening unconscious versus conscious, that's typically universal. But that's its own fun question, Moya. I love that you're asking that. And so when it comes to what's going on under the hood, when I first started teaching neuroscience, researchers would say about 80% of our thoughts are unconsciously driven. And really, our brains are taking in so much stimulus on any given day that we don't have time to consciously process that. And so it does it for us, and then it pops it out as ideas that we claim, but it's been percolating for a long time before it's ever something that we consciously get to claim. Now, scientists are saying 98 to 99% of your thoughts are your brain doing those thoughts under the hood, not you guiding them, your brain guiding what it thinks is going on for you, which means that 1 to 2% is that conscious part. So your brain is much more involved with the thought processes and running you than you might actually be thinking you have available. And so, with that in mind, and knowing that our brains are looking for survival, we pay far more attention to negative things than positive things. And so there's a tool that you can take away for your teams and for your customers that I want you to play with because it's pretty magical. So for every one negative thing that you think or say, so this also could improve your own personal dialogue with yourself, is it takes 3 positive things to neutralize that one negative thing. Now, that's just to break even. If you want to improve relationships, then it becomes a 5-to-1 ratio. So for every one negative thing I say, 5 positive things are going to start building out the positivity of those relationships that we have. The research says there's values going all the way up to 12-to-1. But at least if you start with 5, that's fantastic. So that means you really have to think about how you present to people and what is coming out of your mouth. How do you say things in a way that are positive versus negative so that it doesn't deteriorate those relationships and the trust that you have with people? But that also means the way that you give feedback needs to take this into mind. So one of the ways of evaluations, performance evaluations that we don't like anymore, but a lot of people still do it. And you've probably experienced this is where you get an evaluation and somebody says, my evaluator says, Carol, you do really good at XYZ. Now, this other section, it's kind of lacking and you need to shore that up. But you also do really good at this other thing. What do you think I go home and talk to my family and friends about? Do you think I talk about those 2 positive things or do I talk about that negative thing? I absolutely go in, can you believe they think blah, blah, blah? It doesn't matter where you put it, it comes off as negative and it is a detractor. So rather than giving people negative criticism, I really want you to talk about complaints versus them as a person. So I would rather that be seen as I'm noticing we're not doing as well on our commitments to delivery to our customers. And what I want to talk about is how we can improve that. It doesn't come off as negative. You're observing that here's something that is something we need to improve. And let's talk about leaning into proving. That's a lot less negative, and that's going to land much better with their brain. And so when we're talking about landing with brains, one example I want to give you is the whole idea of when somebody says, "Hey, can I see you in my office?" Do any of you ever get excited about that? Most people get stressed and go, "Oh my gosh, what did I do? Who told on me? What's going to happen?" You could have gotten employee of the month last year and now you're worried about like, should I clean out my desk before I go there? And all these things trigger our brain. So I'm going to share my screen for just a quick second so that I can show you um, how your brain pays attention to some of the information and actually all of the information that crosses your brain. So, and this is just a quick overview, so don't get worried that I'm going to dive you into a really high techy um, with lots of terms. I'm trying to make this as easy and simple. So when our brains developed, they developed from the bottom to the top. And they also developed from the back to the front. And so all the things that are our most oldest part of our brains, those are the fastest part of our brains. They're very automated. They've been doing what they do for a really long time. And so they don't require as much energy. Now, when we get to this illuminated section, this is called our limbic system. And things in our limbic system might be how emotions hit us. It could be where our memory is. Where behavior is. And within that same limbic system, you'll see on this other side, there's these two little guys called amygdala, or there's two of them, one in each hemisphere. So amygdalae. And they are responsible for our freeze, fight, or flight responses, but they're also interested in some other things like sexual responses, and they're also a little bit interested in new shiny type things. So there's more to these two little critters rather than just it being all fight or flight. But we're going to talk about this today in terms of the fight or flight. And then up on the top of our brain, this gray, bigger area is called our neocortex or our cortex. And it's bigger in us than any other mammals. So that's what separates us from other animals. And this is the slowest part of our brain. So this is where the hungriest part of our brain is, and the most of the energy can get wiped out. Now, within there, I'm going to shut the screen so I can just talk to you a little clearer, is we have what's called the prefrontal cortex, and we have the left side and the right side. And this is where that 1 to 2% of our just of our genius Einstein decision-making part of our brain live. But there's a problem. So when our amygdalas or amygdalae start triggering, they're anticipating something different than what they maybe have experienced or something that feels like a threat. So on any given day, even if we don't have high crisis, our amygdala fire 80 times a day on average. And when they do that, they're getting our body ready to respond. And so what that means is that blood flow moves to things that we don't need, like reproductive organs or digestive tracts, to things that would be beneficial if we had to do a freeze, fight, or flight response, which might be our arms and our legs. And then it does something which is the worst thing for conflict and high stakes conversations, is it shuts down that 1 to 2% of our brain, that's that thinking part of our brain. And so I know you've all had this happen when you've had a conversation that's stressful, that's emotionally driven, has high stakes, and you walk away from the conversation, you start calming down, and then you think, dang it, why didn't I say blah, 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 right? You all know this. And it's because your brain was shut down for business. You became a reaction machine. So all those beautiful, brilliant ideas and strategies are often simply not available. And it also happens with the people with whom you interact. So when you think about whether we do freeze, fight, or flight, it really is an adaptive behavior to your brain of what is the easiest way to save most of the energy. So my first preference as a brain would be, let's just freeze. And the problem maybe won't even notice and go right on by. I don't have to use a lot of energy. I don't have to say anything. I just have to be really still and quiet. That's the easiest thing. Sometimes, then if that's not going to work, then fleeing is our second response. Because if we can get out of the way, we don't have to worry about physical harm to our body or to ourselves and our psyche. So fight becomes a last ditch response. That said, you all know people who come in hot right away. That's their response, right? They're just going to come at you and be maybe a bully. And that's an adaptive behavior, something that they've learned that works. But for the rest of us, our brains decide unconsciously what is the best approach for us. And I'll give you an example of how that worked. So when my divorce was the darkest chapter in my life. I lost so much and it was devastating. Years later, many years later, I start dating the man who is going to become my husband now. And in beginning of relationships, you have conflicts. So say we were over here having a conflict. For him, I was a fleer. So what would happen is I would go running over here, away from him, like I'm out. He would follow me. And the only thing that changed was that our conflict was in a different location, right? And then I thought, well, wait a minute, you're a neuroscience researcher. You can observe this and you can stop this. And I'd go, yeah, that's right. So we'd have a conflict over here, and I'd start fleeing, and I would tell myself, Carol, you're fleeing. And I would say, you're damn right. And I'm out, and so he'd follow me, and here we go again. But over time, I could evolve to say, I notice with you, I'm a fleer. So let me flee and let me get back into my thinking part of my brain. And then I can come back and re enter into this conversation. And then over time, all of that's ended. But what was happening was the person who caused me the most harm in my entire life was my ex husband. I'm now letting somebody else potentially have that same position. And my brain says, that didn't go so well for you last time. Why don't we avoid this whole thing? Right. So it's a process and it takes time and it's progress over perfection in there. And so that's how it plays out. And so when we talk a little bit more about stressed brains, when I wanted to become a firefighter, I was raised very traditionally. It never even crossed my mind that I could be. And so my entry into my intrigue around the fire service was really dating a guy that was a firefighter. Like then, like that was my in. And then I would oftentimes talk about how great his job was and how interesting it was. And he would say, well, why don't you become a firefighter? And I would say, women aren't firefighters. Like it never crossed my mind. I couldn't see it. And over time, I really thought, well, why couldn't I be a firefighter? Why would I not? And so when I decided to commit that, yes, this was going to be my next thing, I started seeing fire engines everywhere. Now, do you think they put a whole new fleet out just for little Carol? Like, oh, she wants to be a firefighter. Let's show her and give her a whole lot of fire engines. It wasn't that. It was just that my brain said, now it's important for her to see those. Now she cares about those. For you, if you're thinking of buying a new vehicle, and you narrow it down to a couple models, you might notice this because all of a sudden you start seeing those vehicles on the road everywhere. Same thing, your brain says, oh, now this is important to you. So now we filter it in. But so many other things never, ever cross our conscious mind because our brains don't see it as value to you. Now, when we're stressed, there's three things that happen that are not helpful. And one is that it lowers our IQ point by about 20 IQ points, which if you're like me, I really want to be smart and I want my brain to be working all the way that it can. It also ruins our memory and makes that a lot harder because it's doing too much to try to regulate us. So some of the other things have to drop. But more importantly, it also raises the blood pressure in the people around us. And that really comes from we pay much more attention to nonverbal communication and get many more cues from that than we do from the words. And so if I come in and I'm furious and I'm furious and you say, "Hey, Carol, what's going on?" And my head's spinning, green stuff spewing out of my mouth, and I go, "Nothing's wrong at all. Why would you even think that?" Well, that's why their blood pressure raises. That's gonna pop out sometime, right? And so I want to let you know too that the stress of your teams and the stress of your brains can actually seep from one brain to the other, and it can kill off neurons. So with our brains, we're born roughly with the same amount of neurons as in our baby brains as in our adult brains, but we don't have the connections that deliver information efficiently from one brain to the other. So I'm going to share my screen yet one more time, and I want you to see what it looks like to lose a neuron and have it die off, because sometimes that's just enough to let you know I'm not kidding. So right in this area is going to be a neuron, and it will cycle through the same clip twice. But when that neuron dies, so does all the information that's in that. And it's not so easy. You can build new neurons, but it's not the easiest task for your brain. So check this out. There it is. And there goes part of your brain. And it'll do it one more time, just for impact. And so this is where I really want you to start getting used to the idea of what is it that we do to manage the things that stress us out so it doesn't become so toxic for our team that we now have less productive teams. And there's one really easy way to do this, which is called a 90-second rule. So I would ask you, have any of you ever been mad longer than, say, 90 seconds? And you have, right? Like, I can be mad for days if there's something that's really triggering me. And here's what happens is when we get the first initial release of chemicals for something that we're experiencing, it takes roughly 90 seconds for that to wash through. And so if you keep being elevated, then that means that you are keeping rethinking the same thought, which is releasing those stress chemicals, and it's shutting down your ability to have effective conversations, which lead to effective resolutions. So there's some things that you can do for this that are helpful when we have those stressed brains. One is to please stop assuming that because you said something that somebody else heard it. You know, if my brain is shut down, I just may not hear what you're saying. I just because I'm thinking of something else, I'm not even open for business. So you may need to make sure that you're fact checking. Did they hear what you said? And you might want to have them repeat it, but you also might want to repeat things multiple times. So when I give something like when I'm mediating, confidentiality is an important part of that. So I tell them in the beginning, this is a confidential process, and I explain it. But then if I separate the parties, I remind them, remember, this is a confidential process. So you shouldn't go out into the waiting room and phone a friend. It means that we're still just us. And when they leave the meeting, I remind them again. So I want to remind people of things that happen at times that are important that their brain might likely hear it better. I'm also a real fan of walking meetings because when our brains are really developing, uh, the average male walked 15 to 20 miles a day. The average female walked 10 to 12 miles a day. And our brains do best when they're highly oxygenated. I also want you to consider taking breaks because if we're highly agitated, and you're trying to power through a conversation, I'm not hearing you. I'm in my fight or flight mode, and we are not going to have the best solutions that we might normally have. So maybe that's a 5-minute break or a 10-minute break just so that we can catch our breaths. Maybe we reschedule till tomorrow or next week, and those things are okay. So the idea back in the day was that we shouldn't go to bed angry. There's no reason you can't go to bed angry because when you go to sleep, you stop working your brain so much. Then that unconscious brain that does most of the work for you anyway gets a chance to be freed up to solve problems, which is why you oftentimes wake up with solutions that hadn't occurred to you before. So when we're looking at physiological cues, what I want you to think about is them from top down. So what might happen is I might start doing something that's called eye blocking. So our average blink rate is 6 to 8 blinks a minute. So if I start blinking a lot, that is my brain trying to give me some space from the intensity of the conversation. I might even start talking to you with my eyes shut because I just need a bigger space. You'll notice people's nostrils flaring. You'll notice, jaws clenching. You'll oftentimes notice lips disappearing because they're trying to hold information in. You'll often notice people get blotchy and get red, and it'll start down here and it will go up all the way to their face. I don't want you to notice it and not do anything. I want you to catch it when it's down here because they're getting fully launched. The more those chemicals come out, which means they're shutting down. You'll notice people, rubbing their hands. You might notice people playing with their fingernails, maybe rubbing, the outsides of their hands. Women oftentimes play with their neck. We might play with our necklaces. We might play with earrings. We might play with hair. Men tend to adjust their clothes more and maybe wiggle a little bit. But there's also that sewing machine leg, where somebody just starts shaking that leg. It's a nervous tension. Their hands might be shaking. They might be shutting down. They might even start like where they actually are not even facing you anymore. And I may be talking to you over my shoulder. That's a sign that I'm trying to block you off. And then, equally as important, is that I can't move my chair forward now. So is that when people's legs, their feet, when they're getting really escalated by you, their feet will move away from facing you to facing the exit. And that's another thing to pay attention to. And so, any of those things that you see, I speak to them. And final thing I see is that people's pitch will start to rise and they will start talking faster. So, all those are things where I might observe. Wow, I can hear that this conversation is escalating you. Let's have a little talk about what's going on because as they're escalated, they're thinking about it. And if we don't get it on the table, you're missing the opportunity to meet them where they're at. So I want you to slow down and speak to those types of things. And it's an observance. You want to say, I'm seeing that you're shaking. And I'm wondering if you can help me understand. Is there something that's troubling you about this conversation? And inevitably, they will tell you. And so talk to those things. Don't just barrel through them because you're missing huge opportunities to connect. So some of these physiological threats become the things that we don't know. So when we don't know something, so like back to the can I see you in my office, then we create what I call evil plot twists. And evil plot twists are really about the uncertainty, which our brains don't like because our brains like to be able to predict. It's really about fear of what might be coming down the road, and it's really about a loss of control. So when I wanted to become a firefighter, and the fire service didn't have any female firefighters there, they didn't want me there. There were all sorts of evil plot twists. They were concerned about things like, can I get them out of a situation? And they had lowered the test scores so that for women, there were lower test scores. I refused to adhere to, I like it was like great gesture, but I didn't want people spending my whole career wondering if I could do it. So I met those test scores. My department or my crew knew that, but sometimes somebody would come in to fill in for a shift and they didn't know that. And they always were curious about whether or not I could do it. Likewise, I'm now in a firehouse spending the night with all of my crew. Do you think maybe some of their wives had some issues with that? Like, what is that going to look like? Those things were scary in there. And these teams had tons of sensitivity training before I came in that were telling them what could happen if they were not nice to me or didn't say the right thing. Do you think any of them wanted to talk to me? No. They even had t-shirts that they printed with a female firefighter with a circle and a slash through it. It was not going to go anywhere. And the only way you get through these evil plot twists is to have conversations and to bring people together so that we can explore all those things that are just happening under the hood. Now, one of my favorite things to talk to you about under the hood are something called mirror neurons. And they're neurons that are on the front sides of our brain. And they were originally found from some Italian researchers who were working with monkeys. And they had the monkeys electroded up. And at some point, one of the researchers was eating a snack, and the electrodes on the monkey started crackling as if the monkey was also eating, but the monkey was just watching the researchers. So these have learned and become mirror neurons, but what they are is they help us sync. So back to that nonverbal communication that we pay so much more connection to than the words. We started realizing that I can better read your empathetic cues and your emotions and your feelings because our facial expressions and our brains sync. And likewise, back and forth. And so, with that, becomes a really great way to advance your relationships by using these mirror neurons. So, the one golden rule that maybe is a superpower when you're using neuroscience and high stakes conversations, these could even be sales conversations where I just want to close the deal, is he or she who has control of their emotions the most wins. And I'll say it again. He or she who has control of their emotions the most wins. So if I'm channeling Mother Teresa and you come in really hot and are mad as hell, and I am just kind and patient and listening, and my voice is calm, and I'm talking slowly, and you're going to de escalate because our brains sync. Likewise, if I came sliding in sideways and maybe wasn't feeling great and had something else happen before then, and you're all fired up, you might get me to where I'm fired up and snapping back at you. So I want you to learn that you can manage this really well. And the look is also with what I call a Mona Lisa smile. And it's a smile that generates trust in the person with whom you're interacting with more than 20% improvement. And in business, it's all about trust. And so it's a soft smile that activates the muscles around your eyes. And if you're inclined to do Botox, do not do it around your eyes because it's in this spot and in this soft smile that tells my brain that you are my friend, not a foe, going back to the savannah. And with that in mind, it is fantastic. And I'll tell you a quick story about how it plays out in my relationship that quite frankly drives me nuts. But I'll explain that in a second. So my husband, is just really one of the nicest guys on the planet. He doesn't have a lot of words, but when he says something, it's really valuable. He likes to listen. I deal with conflict day in, day out, fight with people day in, day out, and I love it. It doesn't bother me. And then when it does, it's usually my husband or my son that generate my worst response. And all the stuff that I share with you goes away, and I become like a mad chihuahua. And my husband thinks that's really funny, right? Because instead of having a reasonable conversation, I come off as and he will just sit and he will just smile, that Mona Lisa smile. He might say, "You got anything else?" He might say, "Did you get it all out?" And he's just looking at me with all the love in his eyes and ready. What happens is the mirror neurons in my brain start making me involuntarily smile because they are syncing with his brain, and the game is over, right? Because now, and I get so mad because I'm not done being mad. Um, but it's over, and he'll laugh because he knows once I'm smiling, I'll go, "I'm not ready yet to smile." And he'll say, "I know, but can we just talk now?" And we do, and it's over. And you all have this ability with every human on the planet as well. If you practice getting yourself really grounded with what is it that I want coming out of me, and with just hanging in there with that Mona Lisa smile. So, moving on with that, I want to talk a little bit more about perceptions and neural pathways. I had mentioned that with perceptions, it's all about how we see the world. But because our unconscious brain is doing much of the work, we don't see the world as the rest of us do. So, arguing about how something went down or how you saw it versus I saw it is valuable, but not fighting about that's not how it happened, because we're each having a very different experience. And there's so much research about that. So, more what I want you to do is I want you to think about what it is that your perception is. And then, can I share what mine is? And just recognize that they don't have to be the same. And you might both be wrong with what actually went down. But these neural pathways that create our perceptions are really there about helping us save time so that we don't have to look at something every time the first way, and reassess it. And our brains like to reject information that it doesn't agree with your current beliefs in there. So, with that in mind, I'm going to share a quick screenshot for you, and followed by a video that will really help drive this home. And so let me go back to that screen share. And so there was some research that was done with the Namibian tribe out of Africa. And that tribe doesn't have a word for blue, but they're jungle dwelling. So they have many words for green. And so the researchers were wondering, how does our language impact our perceptions? And so they did this experience with the tribes people where they showed them a circle of green boxes with one blue box. Can you all see where the blue box is? Pretty easy. It's there, right? So then for the second phase, they took people like us who have some colors for green, but it's not important to our world because we're not jungle dwelling so much. And they wanted to know if out of a bunch of green boxes, if we could find the one green box that is not the same as the others. Going back to perceptions, the tribes people have no problem picking out the box that's different. And I promise that there is one. Can any of you see which one it is? Ashley, which one do you think it is?
I think it's on when I'm looking, it's at my like 2 o'clock-ish.
Like over here?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else have a different guess? Or any of you have like no idea, can't figure it out?
I am shade colorblind, so they all look green to me.
They
All the
all
same.
Yeah, and can we agree it's not an easy guess? It's more of a guess. I'll have people say it's one of these. I mean, it's whenever if I could talk to everyone all at the same time, we would not have agreement on this, but this is the right one. So Ashley, you found it. So most people don't. So good job, Ashley. And so with that in mind, this is just an idea to let you know it really is complex on what we perceive. Now I want you to take that information and think about labels. So I'm wondering when you are in conflict or with someone, or you're dealing with someone even that you just simply are not in conflict with, but with whom you disagree, I'm wondering what labels do you call people? So I oftentimes hear that they are obstinate, or they are misinformed, or they are difficult. And I'm sure some of you are thinking of words of profanity, like we have even, meaner words for people who don't agree with us. But what happens is those labels then impact how our brains see people. And if we give them negative labels, we're less likely to collaborate them on ways to get beyond these difficult situations. So when you label people negatively, you start solving them rather than the problem. And I really want you to get used to thinking of people, whether they agree with you or not, as collaborators in what you're trying to do, because your brain will listen to them better. Now, this is one of my favorite videos to share on labels. And I want you to just notice how these labels pop out for the people in this experiment. So here you go.
You're about to meet Michael. He lives fast as a self-made millionaire.
You didn't have to dress up. It's all right.
You're going to photograph Michael. He's actually saved somebody's life. Michael is an ex-inmate. He's a commercial fisherman. Michael claims to be psychic.
Nice to meet you.
Michael's a former alcoholic. Here's your camera. I would like you to flesh out the essence of who he is.
What would you like out of this? What would you like the photograph to say about you?
Do you find that being a psychic impacts much on your day-to-day life?
I can see this is emotional for you.
Like to get to know the person. You've only got 10 minutes, right?
I think you're a guy that's put yourself out there. You're not hiding anything. My plan was to find out about whoever it was and to try and get that. And what I learned from him is he's incredibly brave.
It was really intense. Pull this shirt out. Sorry.
I wanted to see the nature of the person, which then present a challenge. How do you portray him as a fisherman?
That's perfect.
He's a self-made millionaire and sort of a little bit intimidating. I wasn't going for a beautiful, nice, perfectly lit portrait.
I just want to try bring out something of who you are. I think that you just treat people like the everyday people, like everybody is.
Pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you
you so much.
I hope I've got that guy's bravery on film.
So it was a very intimidating environment.
So you work.
I like the empty chair next to it too.
Because it's a totally different person.
Almost looks like 6 different people. So not everything I told you today was true. fishermen. I am not an alcoholic. The GFC hit me hard, but I've never been a millionaire. I've never been in prison. I am a Bondi lifesaver, but the story we talked about never did happen. Not psychic. Can barely spell it.
Before I knew there were different characteristics, I thought, that's really strange. These don't look like portraits of the character I thought you were. You always got your own preconceptions and you've got your ideas.
It pushed me into a position and a space that I wouldn't normally be in.
You have to dig a lot deeper. It means you've got to be, I think, a lot more creative to work out how you're going to play things.
Isn't it interesting how we label somebody can make it so different in how we see them? And with the final last couple minutes, I also want you to realize another really important thing that happens in the world of our brain is the more we recall something that happened in the past, and especially if it's something that was a conflict or something that made us not happy, the more we align with it. So when we're having difficult conversations, I want people not to get stuck into the past of saying this happened and this happened and this happened, and then, you're arguing about it. We know I want the overview, a 30,000-foot view, if you think of an airplane view. And then I want people to really talk about what it is that went wrong there, not how, but just what is it and where do you want to go to the future? Many times people come to me and they're all ready to share all the things that they hate, and that went mad or went wrong. And when I say, how do you want to see this improved? It shocks them because they've never considered it because they're too angry being mad. So with that in mind, I want you to think about asking better questions. So instead of asking why did you do that? Instead, I want you to ask what questions. So it might be more of, this happened. That wasn't really our best thing. What are we going to do to make that better in the future? And those, if you can take a little of all of these kind of things, they have profound impacts. And I recognize that I blew through all of this information as a quick data dump for you. I will give a PDF of the slides so that they can give them to all of you so that you can have access to them. But this is the type of stuff I teach, consult, and share on all the time. So if there's ever a point in time that I can help you or your teams learn more about this in a way where you get to practice some of those skills and ask tons of questions, just know that's my favorite thing on the world to do. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our conference coordinators for any closing thoughts or questions before I let you get back on to the rest of your fantastic day.
Anybody have any questions? Follow up with that? No? Awesome. Thank you so much, Carol. We really appreciate you coming on and giving us all that great and fantastic information. Our